Have you ever wondered how an entire civilization can vanish almost overnight? How could advanced kingdoms with writing systems, maritime trade, and powerful armies be reduced to silence, leaving behind only ruins and unanswered questions? Imagine a world where communication between distant peoples was already carried out through diplomatic letters, where there was a literate elite capable of recording the intricate details of wars, royal marriages, and trade agreements on clay tablets, where temples weren't just religious centers, but economic institutions managing grain, metals, and human labor, where bronze wasn't just a metal but the very symbol of an entire era, the Bronze Age. And then, within a few short decades, all of it disappeared. Cities were burnt, palaces looted, languages forgotten, writing systems abandoned. It was as if humanity had pressed a reset button without a backup. This obscure event, known to scholars as the Bronze Age collapse, remains one of the greatest mysteries in archaeology and world history. This video will take you on an intense journey, told in the first person, not just to understand what happened but why it still matters. We'll talk about ambition, fragility, historical cycles, and the dangers of ignoring the warnings history keeps offering us. Because the same forces that brought down civilizations over 3,000 years ago, climate change, economic collapse, wars over resources, and the loss of cultural identity, are now staring us in the face again. And if you think you're immune, think again. Throughout this video, you will discover how mighty empires vanished without leaving convincing explanations, the role of environmental factors, ones that now threaten our own stability, the critical importance of historical memory in preventing new collapses. Like, share, and subscribe, and comment below. Are we repeating history? Because your voice helps this message reach those who still need to wake up. Now, take a deep breath, turn off the lights, and dive with me into the mystery. They say the world began with chaos, but what I saw was the opposite. A beginning marked by order and ambition. I lived through the days when humanity believed it had conquered nature, when temples reached toward the heavens and kings were treated as gods. I was young when I first stepped into the grand corridors of Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. Everything felt eternal. The Cyclopean walls, the archives filled with tablets, voices echoing in many tongues. There was a kind of artificial harmony held together by force, but it worked. Back then, no one questioned fate. People trusted in bronze, in hierarchy, and in the gods. The Greek city-states were booming. Mycenae and Turns, with their fortified citadels, echoed with the clinking of trade and the roars of warriors. To the south, Egypt reached its peak under Ramses II, the Great. To the east, Ugarit shone as a cosmopolitan hub, where Syrian merchants traded with people from across the Mediterranean. The economy was a living web sustained by maritime routes, caravans, oaths, and gold. From the mines of Anatolia to the ports of the Levant, goods flowed like blood through the veins of a giant. But this interdependence had a cost, one no one seemed willing to see. Innovation was constant. The wheel was already old, cuneiform. Writing blossomed in every administrative center. Babylonians mastered astronomy, Egyptians, engineering, and amid it all, a cultured elite emerged, scribes and priests who believed they could record everything, even the future. In my youth, I saw all this as progress, but over time, I learned too much structure can also be the seed of collapse. The more interconnected the world became, the more fragile it grew. I remember the first time I saw a Phoenician inscription outlining trade routes to Cyprus, where the copper needed for bronze was mined. The realization that our entire economic foundation depended on the stability of just a few distant sources unsettled me. But in times of glory, no one listens to a dissonant voice. Peace wasn't the absence of war, it was well-managed domination. When conflicts rose, like between the Hittites and Egyptians, we signed treaties. Like the famous Treaty of Kadesh, the oldest known peace agreement. We carved it into stone, proudly, as if eternity were a choice. The homes of the wealthy were adorned with Minoan pottery, their kitchens sizzled with recipes inherited from 5 different cultures. Never before had humanity experienced such a fusion of ideas, art, science, and faith. It was a golden age and everyone believed it would last forever. But that blind confidence planted the seeds of ruin. Everything was decentralized. Populations grew, demanding more food, more metals, more slaves. Bronze, the foundation of the age, required tin, and tin was rare, very rare. We depended on faraway sources, and the slightest disruption in those routes could lead to widespread scarcity. Life was good for some. The elite thrived, temples accumulated wealth. But far from the walled cities, in the fields, complaints began to rise. Farmers faced unpredictable rains. The gods' once generous grew ever more silent. At the time, it was easy to ignore the first tremors. There were festivals, games, pilgrimages. It felt like we had conquered fate. But I saw the eyes of the elders in the markets. They remembered other times, and they knew nothing lasts forever. So when the ground began to shake both literally and metaphorically, no one noticed. We were too busy building towers of pride upon foundations of sand. This was the dawn of the golden age, a light so bright it blinded us all to what was coming next. What happens when a system that seems solid begins to crack? There isn't always a boom. Sometimes it's the whispers that come first, and I heard those whispers in the plazas, in the markets, in the letters sealed with urgency and dread. It was around my 30th cycle when I started to notice messages between kingdoms grew tense. There was less diplomacy, more demands. The clay tablets once filled with treaties and trade deals now carried pleas for help, warnings of invasions, reports of looting. Kings no longer called each other brother, but rival. The soil, once fertile, hardened. Rains, so vital for agricultural communities, failed year after year. Mesopotamia began to dry. The Nile's delta shrank. Dams could no longer hold. And then came the plagues, locusts, disease, fungal rot in the crops. Hunger was no longer a distant rumor. It was a reality in the empty bowls of children. On the roads, travelers stopped being messengers. They became refugees. Entire families abandoned their lands, seeking refuge within city walls. But inside, there was no space, no bread, only rising tension, social, political, religious. I saw the temple of Enlil in Nippur desecrated by its own devotees. The high priest wept not for the relics but for the loss of faith. When the gods stay silent for too long, their followers go mad. Armies became tools of internal repression. I saw Hittite soldiers crush uprisings in small villages that couldn't meet their grain quotas. I saw scribes falsifying records to hide agricultural losses. Local chiefs bribed messengers to keep the truth from reaching the palaces. And among merchants, fear spread. Trade routes were easy targets. Raids increased. Pirates multiplied. The sea, once a bridge between civilizations, became a dangerous border. Trust, the lifeblood of trade, evaporated. But the most terrifying thing was the silence. A slow, creeping silence. Cities that used to exchange 5-10 letters a month now sent one or none. I saw kings send emissaries to neighboring realms never to hear back. Interdependence, once our strength, had become a weakness. Like a row of vessels connected by tubes, if one clogged, they all failed. Within the walls, the elite tried to maintain the show. Festivals were staged, tributes demanded, but the mask of normalcy no longer hid the cracks. Religious chants sounded more desperate than sacred. Markets overflowed with gold but starved for grain. I remember a line written by a scribe in Ugarit, barely legible on a crumbling tablet. War is at the gates. Famine is inside. The gods have turned their faces from us. Rumors became screams. Screams became riots. Riots became civil war. From forgotten villages, tribal leaders emerged to challenge ancient kings. Some spoke of new gods, others only wanted bread. But they all shared one thing. They no longer believed in the system. And so, while bronze still gleamed in the temples, the foundations of civilization were already rotting. No one knew exactly what was coming, but everyone felt it. Something was approaching. Something no army, no god, no scribe could stop. This was the beginning of the end. And I was there to watch instability take form. Not like a thunderclap but like a whisper that would soon become a scream. The first time I heard of them, it came as a whisper laced with fear. They came from the sea, said a fisherman, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if speaking their name might summon them back. They had no known king, no language we could understand, but they had a clear purpose, destruction. It began as rumors, burned ships, plundered villages, missing fishermen. Then came the refugees, peasants, merchants, wounded soldiers. All told the same story, with slight variations. A fleet of strange vessels with square sails, high prows, and savage warriors landing like storms upon every coast. They did not seek tribute. They did not negotiate. They spared neither temples nor women. They were warriors of the world's end. Ugarit, once prosperous and radiant, fell silent. A single clay tablet, pulled from the ashes of a palace, carried the final words of a desperate scribe. The enemy ships are visible. Our city is lost. Egypt called them the Sea Peoples. Most other civilizations didn't even have time to name them. They simply vanished. But who were they? Where did they come from? Why did they attack? Theories abound to this day. Displaced groups fleeing climate disasters? Survivors from smaller empires that had already collapsed, rebellious mercenaries? Or perhaps a confederation of wandering tribes united by desperation or vengeance? I saw a survivor from Tyre, his eyes empty, describe the invaders with clinical precision. They wore leather armor, carried long spears, round shields, and their screams tore through the sky. But the most terrifying thing was the silence with which they advanced. There was no chaos, there was method. The impact was devastating. Coastal cities, with no time to react, were the first to fall. Within months, trade networks crumbled. Connections between empires were severed like thin threads. The economy collapsed not just from material loss but from the paralysis of fear. The terror was so deep that even today, written records of them are scarce. Not due to a lack of events, but because in desperation, writing stopped being a priority. When you must choose between raising a spear or a stylus, history always loses. Even mighty, ancient Egypt staggered. Ramses III faced the sea peoples in epic battles. He won, according to inscriptions at Medinet Habu. But the cost was high, and the victory perhaps incomplete. Because what they left behind wasn't just ruins, it was collective trauma. For years, no one sailed with confidence. Coastal villages were abandoned. Walls were now built facing the sea, a reminder that danger sometimes comes from the water, not the land. The sea peoples never built empires, never founded cities, but in just a few decades, they erased entire civilizations, and then, they vanished like ghosts. Perhaps someday, someone will tell our story the same way. Perhaps, one day, someone will say, they came from the net, from the screens, and brought down everything that once seemed indestructible. But back then, we were the ones caught off guard, and they the harbingers of collapse. It all began with smoke on the horizon. It wasn't war, not yet. It was the sky closing in, day after day, like an omen. I remember one failed harvest, then another, dry winds, rains that never came, earth hardened like stone, rivers shrank, wells stopped singing. Modern science speaks of climate cycles, atmospheric shifts caused by natural phenomena. But back then, all we knew was, the gods were angry. The priests offered more and more sacrifices, but the heavens remained unmoved. No good omens, only silence. Later, we learned that somewhere far away, perhaps in Santorini, a colossal eruption had spewed tons of ash into the atmosphere. Sunlight dimmed for weeks, temperatures dropped, rain patterns shifted, the seasonal cycle collapsed. And when the land suffers, the people suffer too. Crops withered, stored grain rotted. What little food remained was confiscated by the kings. To keep order, they first tightened taxes, then they tightened their fists. That's when the earthquakes began. First minor tremors, then nights when the ground rolled like the sea. Entire cities crumbled. Palaces collapsed. In ancient times, they said it was the wrath of buried gods. Today, we know tectonic plates were shifting in waves. The coastal zones of the Aegean and Anatolia were hit hardest. Many ports already weakened by the collapse of trade were abandoned after the quakes. Walls that once protected became deadly traps, crumbling on those who sought shelter. In the chaos, disease spread, water contaminated by corpses, overcrowding in refuge cities, food shortages. It was the perfect storm for plague. Without proper medicine or scientific understanding, people turned to superstition and fear. I saw mothers offer their children to the gods on makeshift altars. I saw madmen wandering through ruins, covered in ash, proclaiming the end of the world. I saw once great centers of knowledge turned into silent graveyards. And all of this happened alongside invasions, political collapses, and internal revolts. A perfect storm from the inside out and the outside in. Yet still, most believed it was temporary, that things would return to normal. But the climate didn't return. Fertile lands turned arid. Trade routes, dependent on seasonal predictability, vanished. Kingdoms that once demanded grain tribute became beggars. Civilization's greatest strength, interdependence, had become its downfall. Looking back now, I see that natural disasters weren't just the backdrop. They were central characters. They didn't destroy everything alone, but they pushed an already fragile system past the point of return. And I wonder, if back then, the sky could become our enemy, what keeps us from ignoring the signs today? When you look at the world, at patterns of extreme weather, floods, droughts, unstable crops, can you hear the echo of those times? Because I do, and it sounds familiar, too familiar. There was a time when walls meant protection. Now, they only enclosed despair. I was in Hattusa when it fell, not in a single day but in fragments of time. Like a body decaying from the inside out before collapsing, the city, once alive with bureaucrats, merchants, and warriors, became a cemetery of echoes. At first, the decline was invisible. Plazas were emptier, markets less stocked, scribes quieter. Then, the gates began to close earlier. Guards, once symbols of protection, now eyed every traveler with suspicion. Fear seeped through the palace cracks. The great cities of the Bronze Age didn't all fall at once. They withered, some over months, others over years. What killed them wasn't just war or famine, it was the loss of purpose. When trade stopped, temples withered. When tribute ceased, soldiers deserted. When kings stopped writing, people stopped believing. I was in Ugarit weeks before its fall. The libraries were still intact, the gardens withered, the elite debated political theories while commoners emptied the storehouses. And then the ships came. There was no resistance, only flames. The same happened in Mycenae, in Turin's, in Tyre, cities that for centuries were centers of culture, governance, and religion, all of them, one by one, reduced to rubble. The urban collapse was more than physical destruction. It was structural transformation. People fled the cities, returned to the land, founded villages, rejected the old gods. The urban model, the ultimate symbol of civilization, was now shunned. Like a curse, palaces became storage rooms, temples looted ruins, administrative archives fuel for cold night fires. All the complexity that sustained cities' accounting, justice, religion, diplomacy vanished. And what rose in its place? Chaos, disconnected villages, local lords, armed gangs, every man for himself. Where once there was a connected world, now there were fragments of survival and fear. I saw the last processions, the last rituals, the last minted coins. And after that, silence became the new language. The cities didn't just fall. They were forgotten, their stones reused, their stories erased, their memories mere whispers among survivors. And so, the civilization that once built itself in stone was reduced, once again, to dust. There was a time when every gesture of a king was recorded, every harvest counted, every treaty sealed with words etched in clay, stone, or papyrus. Writing was the pillar of civilization that embodied memory of gods and men. But when everything collapsed, the first thing to vanish was the word. I remember the day I stepped into the scribe's house in Ugarit after the fire. The tablets were still warm, some cracked, others reduced to charcoal. There lay international treaties, tax lists, sacred hymns, medical recipes, all irreversibly lost. The literate elite vanished like smoke. Scribes, priests, and librarians were killed, exiled, or became anonymous peasants, without masters. There were no disciples, and without disciples, writing died in silence. Cuneiform writing, complex and precise, was abandoned. The Phoenician alphabets, still in their infancy, weren't enough to preserve the legacy. In some regions, records disappeared for centuries. It was as if civilizations had chosen to forget themselves. Without record, there was no more history, only legend. Great deeds turned into myths, and myths into superstition. I saw children grow up without knowing the names of kings who had ruled their grandparents. I heard elders tell distorted tales of cities they themselves had helped build. The loss of writing wasn't just a failure of documentation, it was a failure of identity. People no longer saw themselves as part of something greater. Without written laws came arbitrariness. Without archives came corruption of memory. Without words came fear. Rituals were simplified, ceremonies reduced to hollow gestures. Even the names of the gods began to change or disappear. Religion, without preserved sacred texts, fragmented. Sects emerged, obscure cults, contradictory interpretations, and it wasn't just words that vanished. Agricultural techniques, medical formulas, astronomical knowledge, construction methods, all were lost with the records. Humanity unlearned itself. Once, I found a tablet buried in the mud of a rural home. No one there could read to them. It was just a stone with old scratches, but I knew it held the description of an alliance between two vanished kingdoms, an echo of diplomacy that no longer existed. And I thought, if everything we are depends on what we remember, who are we when we forget? The silence of scripture was the silence of the human soul, a void that echoed for generations. And that's why even now I write, because I know the value of the word, and I know the price of its absence. After the fall, the world didn't end, it simply dimmed, like a lamp bursting in the middle of the night, leaving the room in absolute darkness. Those who survived the destruction of cities, the silence of the gods, and the collapse of words scattered across the land like lost fragments. I walked through villages hastily built on the smoldering ruins of once glorious palaces. Men who once commanded armies now tilled the soil with primitive tools. Women who once wore perfumes from Egypt now crushed roots to survive. Splendor had turned to dust. There were no more kings, only local chieftains, with power limited to the reach of their own sight. Interregional trade ceased. Bronze disappeared not because the metal was gone, but because the knowledge to produce it was forgotten. The forge fell silent, the glow of civilization swallowed by the rust of time. The nights were longer, not only because there were no more city lights, but because there was no more music, no more celebrations, no more shared stories. Each village was an isolated world, each settlement a desperate attempt to rebuild without foundations. I saw children who never learned to read, who had never seen a temple, who had never heard of Hattusa, Mycenae, Ugarit, or Babylon. I saw young warriors wield weapons without knowing for which king they fought. Because there were no more kings, only survival. Wars changed, once diplomatic, calculated, ruled by treaties. Now they were raids, tribal battles, fights over grain, land. Wounded pride, justice disappeared with the clay tablets. Right and wrong became flexible concepts, defined by the sword. In some places, like Greece, even writing vanished for centuries, an archaeological void, a scandalous silence, as if history itself had skipped a chapter. Art regressed, buildings became crude, pots, unpainted, musical instruments, stringless. The era's aesthetic was scarcity, creativity suffocated by hunger. And yet, amid the darkness, there were sparks. In a village in Anatolia, I met an old man who had guarded an intact tablet, hidden for decades. In another, a woman sang ancient songs, lyrics passed from mother to daughter. Somewhere, memory endured. This dark age wasn't uniform. Some regions resisted more, others recovered faster. But the trauma that was universal, the world had been shattered, and no one knew how to piece it back together. I, who once lived under the golden light of empires, now walked in the shadows of forgetting. The dark age wasn't just a time, it was a state of the soul, and it was there, in that emptiness, that the questions began to rise. Who were we? Where are we going? Can we rebuild what we lost? But above all, are we doomed to repeat the cycle? Because in the darkness, everything feels eternal, until the light returns, or until the last spark dies out forever. For years, I tried to understand. I wandered through the ruins of dead cities, spoke with the last old men who still remembered names no one else uttered. I read what was salvaged from the ashes, traced maps with routes long erased by time. But the more I searched for answers, the more the questions multiplied. The collapse of the Bronze Age had no single cause. It was a mosaic of catastrophes, a domino effect, each falling piece accelerating the next. But why did it all happen at once? Why, between 1200 and 1150 BCE, did so many civilizations collapse nearly simultaneously? Some blame the Sea Peoples, and indeed, their impact was devastating. But were they the cause or the consequence? Many historians now believe they were refugees, victims of the same climate and social collapses that destroyed the empires. Others see them as opportunistic raiders who filled the vacuum of power. Others blame nature, climate change, prolonged droughts, cascading earthquakes, eruptions. All these factors are documented. Archaeological evidence shows ash layers, cracked buildings, piles of unburied bones. But no natural disaster alone wipes out so many worlds. Some blame economics, dependence on fragile trade routes, over bureaucracy, wealth hoarded by disconnected elites. When the bronze flow stopped, the world literally ran out of weapons. When tribute failed, palaces collapsed from within. And there's an even darker theory: cultural exhaustion. The idea that these societies became so rigid, so unable to adapt, that they collapsed under their own weight. Death by stagnation. A system that could no longer respond to new challenges. I saw inscriptions ending mid-sentence, buildings left unfinished, signs of hurried flight. It was as if the world had tried to continue, until it couldn't. Modern scholars still argue, each holds a piece of the puzzle. But maybe the mistake is in trying to find a single cause. Maybe the real mystery lies in the complexity, in the fatal interplay between environmental, political, economic, cultural, and military forces. What scares me is not the unknown, but how familiar it all feels. We are more connected than ever. We rely on global systems for food, energy, safety. Climate change is already unfolding. Disinformation spreads like fire. Elites accumulate more than they need. And the poor, well, They are growing in number. Are we repeating the same pattern? The civilizations of the Bronze Age didn't foresee their fall, but they left clues, and we, who have deciphered those clues, have a duty not to ignore them. Because maybe the greatest mystery isn't what caused their collapse, but why, despite knowing so much, we still gamble with our own. What's more disturbing, knowing that the world has already collapsed once, or realizing we're walking a similar path? When I look around, I don't see echoes. I see reflections. We live in an age of extreme connectivity, global supply networks, interdependent financial systems, cultures linked by clicks. But what once was strength has become fragility. A failure in one sector, energy, grain, communication, can trigger a global crisis, and it's already happening. The climate is changing. The same signs that preceded the ruin of ancient civilizations: prolonged droughts, mass migrations, tensions over resources have returned, disguised as headlines. But now, the world is bigger, and if the fall comes, it will be from a much greater height. Cities have once again become vulnerable giants, over-dependent on technology, transport, and political stability. Faith in institutions is collapsing. Polarized governments, discredited media, inequality spiraling out of control. Sound familiar? And the people feel it. There's a vague anxiety in the air, a chronic fatigue, and nameless fear. I've seen it before in the eyes of those who lived in the final cities, those who knew intuitively that something massive was about to break. But it's not too late, not yet. The past isn't a prophecy, it's a warning. The Bronze Age collapse shows us that highly complex systems, when they stop adapting, break. And they break fast. The key isn't strength, it's flexibility. Have we learned from the past? Barely. Most still believe we're above history, that we're different. But anyone who studies fallen civilizations knows pride comes before the fall. The lessons are clear. Diversification is survival. Depending on too few resources, routes, or suppliers is a fatal flaw. Investing in local resilience is more important than global expansion. Knowledge must be shared, not hoarded by elites. Culture must stay alive and questioning, not fossilized in dogma. And the greatest lesson, memory. Without it, we repeat. With it, we can respond. But remembering isn't enough. We must act. We need to rethink our relationship with nature, with technology, with power. We need to build civilizations that are not just sophisticated but wise. And maybe, by telling this story, I can light a candle in the darkness that is beginning to close in around us. Maybe, if we understand that the past isn't buried but alive inside us, we can change direction. Because time is running out, and history doesn't wait. Some things never truly vanish, not even after fire, collapse, or silence. They remain. Not in the books that were burned, not in the cities that were abandoned. They remain in us. In what we are, in what we dream, in what we fear. That is, the forgotten legacy. I saw generations grow up not knowing who their ancestors were. I saw children given names whose origins had been lost to the dust of time. I saw monuments fall, and over their stones, fragile wooden houses rise unaware they stood atop the bones of history. But now and then, something would resurface. A symbol carved into an old beam. A song sung at sunset. An incomplete ritual, passed down by a grandfather who barely remembered why. Fragments, echoes, seeds that survived the storm. Over centuries, these seeds germinated. And much of what we now call reborn civilization, the alphabet, trade, the idea of the state, sprouted from that dark, forgotten soil. The collapse didn't erase everything. It reset, as if humanity had been forced to remember what truly mattered. And what remains, the awareness that everything is transient, that progress is an illusion unless paired with humility, that knowledge is useless if not passed on, that wealth is pointless if not shared, that strength means nothing if it doesn't protect. The great civilizations of the Bronze Age left more than ruins. They left lessons, some explicit, in rescued tablets, others carved into our recurring mistakes. I carry these stories not as lamentation, but as a warning. I am not just a spectator of the past. I am a witness, a bridge between what was and what might be. And if you've made it this far, reading or listening, then so are you. The forgotten legacy is not just theirs, it's ours. It's in how we treat the land, in how we educate our children, in how we respond to crisis. It's in our daily choices, to trust or to fear, to isolate or to cooperate, to forget or to remember. Because in the end, history doesn't repeat itself, it responds. And if we listen closely, we just might change the answer. The Bronze Age fell, but the human spirit survived. And now, it's up to us to decide what we'll do with what remains. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer, you're a survivor of this journey. We have crossed together through the rise and fall of an entire era. We have touched the ashes of lost civilizations, and now we stand before a mirror, because this story is not just theirs, it's ours. It hides in the electric currents powering our homes, in the data flowing through our networks, in the markets that feed our tables, in the words we type without thinking. Each of these systems, however invisible they may seem, carries the same fragility that once brought empires to their knees. This is our last chance to do something different, to stop the cycle, to turn knowledge into action, to recognize that, just like in the past, change begins with awareness. You can be the spark of a new cycle. You can share this story, discuss it, reflect, teach, question. You can look at your community, your work, your choices and see what can be rebuilt. You can reignite memory. So here's my direct request to you. Comment below. I am the memory that survived. Share this video with someone who needs to wake up. Like this if something inside you was moved. Subscribe to continue exploring forgotten stories and the truths that still matter. Don't let this knowledge die here. Don't let this video be just another one in a sea of content. Let it be a spark, the first of many, because what begins with a memory can end in revolution. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Breathe. Do you feel that? It's the weight of history in your hands. And the question that echoes is simple. What will you do with it?